Hey folks, welcome back. Time for another entry in our month of horror RPGs. This time we're continuing to look at the Trail of Cthulhu role-playing game from Pelgrane Press. Last time we looked at the core rulebook in quite some detail, and this time I'm going to show you three of the most essential supplements, or at least I think so, for the budding Trail of Cthulhu GM. And that is the GM screen and Keeper's Resource Book, and the supplement Rough Magicks, which is only 40 pages, but is packed with new mechanics for spellcasting. You may or may not use them, however, I think regardless of whether you use the magic stat in your game, that supplement has a lot of great new descriptions of old spells and lots of useful information on the magical capabilities of mythos creatures in the setting, so it's a good GM resource one way or the other. So we'll start first with the GM screen and work our way up to Rough Magic, which is probably the most mechanically complex out of these. The GM screen has a lot of really useful stuff, as you would expect. So Trail of Cthulhu is a relatively rules-light system, so there's not an awful lot of mechanics to remember, but there are a lot of useful references here nonetheless. So we have the details for basically all the weapons in the core book, so that includes everything from Derringer pistols, tiny little pistols you might keep in your purse or pants pocket, all the way down to massive explosives, including military strikes and bomber attacks, mortar shells, etc. In between we have machine guns, rifles, and shotguns, so everything you could need or want. Then we have in the center pages on the top there, you can see we have references for the melee weapons, from unarmed punches, clubs, whips, blades, and improvised weapons. And the only stats that are relevant here are damage bonuses, whereas you can see with the range weapons, you have ammo, the costs, the ranges, and the damage bonus at those ranges, and some notes and keywords. And those notes and keywords are handily defined in the table next to the melee weapons table. So bipod means you have to be prone or use a bipod to fire at. Double-barreled means you can use both shells. For example, in double-barreled shotgun. Full auto means you can add +2 to firearms pool or +3 with a 50 to 100 round drum, for example, for a Tommy gun. But if you do, you must reload in your next turn, and you can full auto bonus only once per encounter. Incendiary, you can ignite flammable materials up to long range. Jams, when used on full auto, if you roll a 1, your gun jams even if you hit. Kickback, your round after firing action must be spent on a difficulty 3 athletics test to remain upright. And prone means you must be prone. Pulp only. Cars do not explode in Purist games without using an explosive device. So that's an interesting one. Reliable means you get -1 difficulty on test to repair or unjam the weapon. And small means +1 difficulty to search for the firearm on the person wearing it. So those are all handy references. And then we have basically a summary of pretty much all the game rules in the middle part of the page here. So first, simple tests, contests, and combat tests are all covered in just this one section here. Then the rules for physical injury and death. So what happens when you're hurt, how you make a consciousness roll, and the benefits of first aid. Then same again for seriously wounded. And then of course, when your health pool dips to -12 or below, you are in fact dead. At the bottom is a summary of refreshing abilities during games. So investigative abilities only refresh between complete adventures or major breakthroughs in campaigns. Creatures that encounter for 24 hours refresh everything but their health, which refreshes 1d6 per day. If creatures encountered later in the same day can refresh all but health up to half their rating. The 3 general pools, except health, sanity, and stability, can be refreshed once per session in a safe haven. Athletics, driving, firearms, piloting, riding, scuffling, and weapons refresh 24 hours after the last use. Health refreshes 2 points per day of restful activity. Stability can be covered by following drives: psychological triage or confidence rolls. It gives you page references for all this stuff as well, which is useful, of course. And then on the last page is all about stability and sanity. So on the top we have how a stability test actually works on the very top there of the table. Then we have a stability loss table with examples of things like discovering the corpse of a friend, being attacked by a supernatural creature, being tortured, etc., and the relevant stability loss. And then on the bottom we have the Cthulhu Mythos stability and sanity loss table. So this is when you encounter something of the mythos and the concurrent stability pool loss and sanity pool loss. And then what happens when you come unstrung. So if your stability ranges from 0 to -5, you're shaken, you're distracted, you can't spend points from your investigative abilities, and difficulty numbers for everything in your general abilities increase by 1. If your stability is from -6 to -11, your mind is blasted. You suffer all the effects of being shaken, and the only things you can do are nothing, take flight, or make attacks on any perceived dangers. And you permanently lose 1 point from stability. That's really important to remember. A lot of people forget that. If you are blasted, you lose 1 point from stability forever. Another character can snap you out of it with a difficulty 3 psychoanalysis roll and a 2-point spend. If your stability reaches -12 or less, you are incurably insane. You may commit one last crazy act or check out forever in a puddle of drool. If you survive, you're hospitalized. start a new investigator. And that's really it. I mean, it's not, this is not a mechanics heavy game. So having these big references for all the weapons and the properties, plus the stability and sanity examples is really useful for the keeper. But basically all the rules we need are right here in the middle. So they're right here in front of you. Yeah, with this, you can run the game. I mean, it's pretty straightforward as far as rules content is concerned. We have some lovely art. Forgive the reflections a little bit. You can see it's quite dark. It has that sort of greenish grayscale vibe of the art in the core rulebook. We have in the center a team of investigators looking out upon a valley leading towards some kind of, looks like a hole or some sort of temple carved into the mountain. On the side, we have some mysterious statues and carvings on both edges there. So it definitely gives you that vibe of Trail of Cthulhu, wandering into the edge of madness. In the back, we see some rather fierce-looking peaks. Gives it an extra little bit of that kind of ghoulish unnaturalness. So a nice GM screen, but the main problem is, look how thin it is. You can see I haven't really used it very much, but it does very easily get bent. It's just an old school kind of, laminated cardboard screen. It's not really what you would expect from a lot of modern games, and actually later games from Pelgrane, like Knights Black Agents, have what I would call proper GM screens where they use hardcover book cover stock to make up the screen rather than this kind of laminated cardboard. But, I mean, it's good enough for its purpose. You just have to take a little bit of extra care with it. Make sure you have it nicely secured so it doesn't fall over on whatever you're organizing secretly behind the screen. And it has all the info you need. And in fact, you may find it useful to show this to the players quite often if they want to buy weapons, if they forget how to do certain, combat tests, or if they're wondering how to deal with stability and that kind of stuff. All that is here. So it's useful for anybody around the table, really, but just keep in mind that it is a bit fragile. However, along with this screen, which is very useful, you also get the Keeper's Resource Book. Yes, and this is actually quite thick. It's 70 pages. So this book has a huge amount of useful information for the GM. First of all, they point out in the introduction that Trail of Cthulhu rewards keeper preparation, like most games do. But in particular, investigative play, you either have to be really good at thinking on your feet, think up clues on the spot, to make a story work, or you need to have things planned out so that you make sure you have a good spread of different clues for different abilities so that every player gets their time in the spotlight. You got to spend time thinking about, how can different abilities be used in the right context in a way that makes sense so that the players will be able to figure it out. It's a big challenge to write a scenario for a system, even though clues are given automatically. Your players still have to identify the ability they're going to use, right? So this book gives a great deal of information about that, and you can see in the TOC here, there's a huge amount of content about investigative abilities, and we'll see just how much detail they include. It's fantastic. Then another huge section on general abilities, and again, it also puts them in context of the 1930s setting for the game. So it'll give you examples of this kind of state of the art of each of these skills and occupations during that period of time, which is great as well if you want to keep a 1930s authentic feel. But as they point out here, don't use history as a roadblock. If your players want to do something adventuresome and it feels cool and it's not too far out of bounds, let them do it. Don't, constantly, pick at your players' historical accuracy. That's not really part of the game. The game is to investigate mythos, horrors, and try and survive. So focus on that rather than nitpicking history. And then at the end here, we have a big section of 50 NPCs that can be used basically anywhere you set your game. If you set them in another country than the US, which is obviously where they're coming from with this, the US or UK would work probably equally well. But with a little bit of work, you could just change some names and use the same stats for Sweden or Norway or whatever you want to do. And then a very useful sanity and stability rules summary on page 66, which again, for the keeper, is handy to have alongside the screen, because there is some complexity in the system in that you have this kind of temporary sanity stat and a permanent sanity stat, the stability being the temporary one. So how those interact can be confusing, especially if you're coming from Call of Cthulhu. So without further ado, I'm not going to go through every single ability here, but we'll pick something seemingly innocuous. So a good example is right at the start, accounting, right? A lot of people don't necessarily, when they're making the characters, think, oh, well, accounting is definitely an exciting ability I want to use, right? They're going to think, well, isn't that boring? You're just, you're crunching numbers. What are you going to get from that? But as they point out here, far from being a gray and boring ability, accounting can bring down crime lords and sink unsinkable companies. It's also not just the investigators who might have skills in accountancy. Competent cult leaders, self-made tycoons, savvy crime lords, and even private asylums may all have a man in their employ to do the books. Such people can be potential allies if they're ignorant of their employer's true natures, or they can be utterly devoted henchmen. For each ability, they give examples of how you can use this ability in particularly useful ways in a mystery. So, for example, exposing corrupt practices. So you could use your accounting skill to find out that a entity is separating itself, to do legal tax avoidance, basically. So, there could be a trust that owns a company that owns foundations, and they pass money around, and there's an offshore jurisdiction to avoid local taxation and all that kind of stuff. You could find out instances of money laundering, so declaring illegal income and washing it, cleaning it, supposedly, so that you turn it into real-looking income. Or you could find evidence of smuggling, evasions of customs laws. You could find what they call structuring deposits. So it's the practice of splitting up a large amount of money into multiple small amounts, often deposited in different banks to avoid attention. So if you get a big pile of money from a drug sale, or paid a lot for a mythos artifact and you don't want that to be known, you would spread the money around small deposits or in multiple bank accounts that all ultimately connect to the same person or source. Then they give you some sample special benefits. So if you spend some points from your accounting pool, what that might turn up for you. And there's some great stuff in here too, right? So for example, you could turn up some crooked accounting details that would be very interesting to the authorities and could land someone a lot of jail time. You gain a 2-point dedicated pool for intimidate when used on the accountant responsible or on the person they were working for. Fantastic, right? Or you recognize the person you're trying to deal with isn't as rich as he claims to be. That name belongs to an undischarged bankrupt. You've seen it on some paper somewhere. There's some creditors out there who wouldn't mind being tipped off. You earn yourself a favor from some shady people. Finally, the tax department is especially grateful for your recent work on their behalf, so you gain a 2-point dedicated pool for bureaucracy when dealing with matters related to accounts. And these can all come in handy later when you're trying to unravel the financial intricacies of a big, global cult or something like that. Then they also give you some sample clues that could be picked up in a scene by using this investigative ability. So for accounting, perhaps you find a cleaning business's records show a large cash payment every week at the same time. So that could be a regular client or it could be a sign of money laundering. Anyone watching the business at the right time will see the gangster's henchmen depositing the money. You could find that a corporation is registered out of a small offshore island outside of U.S. jurisdiction. So they must own property out there and perhaps where the CEO is building their cult headquarters. Finally, some custom declarations, also the same shipment of coffee arriving every month. At the same time, witnesses have reported potential cultists hanging around the dock. Whatever there is they're smuggling, it comes from Boston by ship. So that's another clue to where the cult might be hiding. So, we take an ability that doesn't look very interesting from a player point of view, and actually, using these examples, you can express to players that even it might feel like you're stuck being the person with accounting and being the nerd, but actually, this is a really important skill and could really help you to unravel the legal fronts that lead you to the illegal or mythos-based activities lying under the surface. And they do that for every skill in the game. So, for anthropology, they give you examples of what you can get from that and different subspecialties like culture and ethnography, sample special benefits, clues, again with archaeology. So these are all the investigative skills. So we get for each of these, we get sample special benefits and sample clues. And we'll pick another one to look at that seems fairly innocuous. How about, let's say, chemistry. Okay. So actually, the 1930s were a decade of great progress for chemistry. Almost all the missing elements on the periodic table were discovered over the course of the decade, and the use of radiation to transform chemicals was producing more and more interesting results. So here are some techniques that were used in the 1930s that you would know. So titration, that's the process of gradually adding a reagent to a solution until you reach an equilibrium point. So that can be useful to determine whether something is acidic or basic, for example. Gravimetry, which is an analytic process used to determine the amount of substance in a solution by weighing it before and after a transformation. So that could help you to determine how much of an ingredient is in a particular mess of chemicals. Inorganic qualitative analysis. So that's a systematic analysis in which a series of reactions are performed on the solution in order to determine its composition. Some reactions may eliminate possibilities. So the reaction or lack thereof may show a chemical is not present or may confirm the presence of a chemical. Then you have paper chromatography. So you separate chemical compounds by applying the solution to a strip of paper and then dipping the strip of paper into a solvent. Capillary action draws the solvent up the paper strip and into the solution, separating it into its various components. So you can use this to distinguish inks, fabric dyes, and plant pigments. That might be useful, for example, if you want to try and match up, mythical writings that are attached to one branch of a cult and evidence that you find of written down incantations elsewhere, for example. For sample special benefits, so what they give here, the correct way to test the substance you've discovered is by slowly filtering the solution through charcoal for a number of days. However, that a few drops of molybdenum blue will show you what you need to know right away, saving valuable lab time. That'd be great if you're in a time-sensitive investigation, for example. Or in the course of analyzing the slime left behind in a creature's wake, you find a solution that seems to act like a strong acid, dissolving it completely. That will be useful next time you find one of your colleagues imprisoned in a sticky mass of the stuff. So that'll be useful to save one of your friends or allies. Finally, when confronted with an unknown substance, you can announce you've encountered a substance like this before, and you can call for a flashback scene in which you learn the substance's properties and likely origin. That's a really powerful ability. Sample clues could be things like finding a bluish-green residue coating the timbers of a burned-out apartment containing high levels of various chemicals that are very rare on Earth. Most importantly, it's highly toxic. Whatever left this stuff behind is undoubtedly also the cause of the recent killings. Historians have decried a certain document as a fake, as it alludes to technological innovations well in advance of its purported date. However, your analysis of the chemicals in the ink and paper mark it as authentic. It's either a very sophisticated hoax or the claims in the document warrant further investigation. Finally, a soapstone-like box found in some cultist possession seems impervious to harm. It's not even clear what it's made of, since you can't chip off a piece to test. However, after days of experimentation, you find an acid that will dissolve the strange material, allowing you to open the box and discover its contents. So, again, just showing that an ability that seems, fairly dorky, not very exciting, can actually lead to really key benefits. You can open a box from a cultist that you couldn't open before. You can find out a residue that leads you toward the source of recent murders. You can test the authenticity of documents, or whether documents are written with the same ink or same type of pigments, for example. So these are all potentially useful clues. And this is great for the keeper as well, because when you're struggling to think of, well, what can I put in this scene to get player A involved, and they have, a really odd mix of skills. This gives you tons and tons of ideas on how to spice up a scene. You can use these as inspiration. You could use some of them directly, depending on what your mystery is about. So it's a fantastic resource. And especially, I like the special benefits sections, some of which are quite significant. So you can see under intimidation, there's a lot of examples here. There are lots of ways that you can use intimidation that will make you look badass, or they can give you benefits with a point spend. And that's really helpful. Then we also have these little sidebars as well, just to give us that 1930s vibe. So in each section, they'll talk about what the status of, say, criminal law was in the 1930s, or like we did with chemistry, talked about what was being done. It was a big decade for chemistry. We also have some basic background info for the 1930s. So here we have crimes and how they were defined back then. So murder, manslaughter, assault and battery, mayhem, which is causing grievous and irreversible harm to a person's body, such as cutting off a nose or ear, false imprisonment, disturbing the peace, vagrancy, which is being arrested just for basically being a bum, a drunk, or sleeping in parks and sheds, or just loitering, which is still a crime in many public places in the United States, and nobody else in the world really understands that, but that's the way we are. Larceny, robbery, and burglary, of course, still pretty much the same as today, but nevertheless, it helps to know that they were described similar back then. So again and again, we have example after example, special benefits and sample clues for everything, which is great. We've got some nice illustrations as well, and some little interesting sidebars, like how you would go about field dressing a deer, ways to find water in extreme conditions, so condensation, so, ways to collect moisture in the mornings and evenings if you're in the desert, for example. Heavy dew, trees that collect water, like banana trees, palms, and baobabs. Seawater can be boiled, and the moisture accumulating in the cloth will be then fresh if you hold a cloth in steam. And in the ground, you can dig a hole at a low point to accumulate water. In the desert, that may be hard to find a good spot for that, but you definitely want to boil it before use as well, because it'll be full of all kinds of weird stuff. I love some of these little bits of flavor they scatter throughout. So those are the investigative abilities, and then we get into the general abilities, and these are done a little bit differently. So we have just a little bit more description and ideas about how characters could use these general abilities. So disguise, how did they actually identify people during the 1930s? So there was no national system of ID in the United States before 1936, when the New Deal came in, and there was the Social Security system. Then people needed a social security number. Soldiers had a service number, and many people had passports, birth certificates, or driver's licenses, but just as many people had no kind of ID at all. This could make passing yourself off as a different person very easy. So disguising was a lot easier back then. Driving, so Depression didn't hit the automobile industry that hard in the 1930s. And even in the hardest years of the Depression, a lot of Americans were still driving. And there's a nice sample of the early days of stunt driving in the 1930s. So these were maneuvers that you could use in a game, like a handbrake turn, left foot braking, heel and toe to smoothly downshift gears prior to a turn. The bootlegger turn, also known as a smuggler's turn, which is a 180-degree turn at speed. So these were all developed during the 30s, when we had cars with substantially more power than the earlier days of the 20s and the 10s. Similarly, for other skills like electrical repair, so in the 30s, electricity had pretty much replaced coal and gas as a source of power. Electric lighting, electrical appliances were becoming more and more common. And they give some examples of common electrical components. So we got vacuum tubes, batteries, radios. For explosives, common explosives of the 1930s were, we had dynamite by then, TNT, which was relatively weak but popular because it was stable, basically, fairly shock resistant, and doesn't dissolve in water, so you can use it even when it's wet outside. That's a quite valuable thing to know. Blasting caps, which are used to detonate explosives. Filching is, picking pockets or stealing stuff. So some common tricks to do that would be things like drawing attention, distracting people, getting a gang of people to, catch somebody's attention while you pick their pockets, locating the cash, or cutting the strings of a handbag or backpack to just remove the contents while it's being carried. A lot of people won't notice the sudden change in weight until it's too late. Then we have information on firearms laws, which were evolving rapidly in that time. So there was the National Firearms Act in 1934, Federal Firearms Act, and then there were concealed carry permits that were introduced, and they were given only on a case-by-case basis. But individual state laws varied wildly. So commonly the sale of handguns was prescribed or restricted, and licenses were expensive or difficult to obtain. Note, this is very different from Cthulhu in the 1920s, where gun laws were basically a free-for-all, and you could buy pistols through the mail without any sort of law really restricting you. In the 30s, that started to change quite a bit. Then we have some common examples of first aid kit contents of the time. We have different ways of using hypnosis. So we have stage hypnosis, but they compare that to hypnotherapy. He developed what is known as the hypnotizing handshake, a much hyped technique at the time. He would use reverse psychology, ordeals, and confusing questions as a regular part of therapy. So hypnosis was popular as stage entertainment, but was in its earlier stages of development as a real skill to open up the mind. And these days, it's quite commonly used in psychiatry and in counseling as well. In mechanical repair, we have, the different kind of engines available. For piloting, the different kinds of equipment that was available. For example, navigation equipment. In psychoanalysis, we learned that Freudian psychology was the most popular at the time. It was hugely influential, obviously, in Europe. And by the 1930s, most American practitioners were Freudians as well. And then it talks about normal techniques of psychoanalysis, which would be things like free association, dream analysis, which was a big deal for Freud. They thought dreams were signs of kind of your inner wishes being revealed from your unconscious. And hypnosis can also be allowed under psychoanalysis capacity. When you do it this way, hypnosis is the practice of putting the patient into an extremely relaxed, suggestible state prior to another psychoanalytic technique such as free association. So if you're doing a purist game rather than a pulp game, you may want to use hypnosis as a subcategory of psychoanalysis where it's used only for therapeutic reasons and just enhances the effect of other things rather than being a useful skill in and of itself. Scuffling, so there were no formal training needed to become a good fighter, really, but there were some martial arts that were kind of unique to the time that they mentioned. So we have savate, or French boxing, so incorporating kicking and open-handed slaps as well as fighting with a stick, and it developed from French street fighting. Then we have bartitsu, which was a martial art adapted and devised by the Englishman Edward Barton Wright after a visit to Japan. It incorporated traditional boxing, judo techniques, and the use of a walking stick or umbrella for self-defense. How cool is that? By the 1930s, this had mostly died out, but older British gentlemen might still have training. And in fact, Sherlock Holmes was supposedly a master of this art. And finally, we have boxing. So the Queensberry rules were the formal rules of boxing adapted in 1867 and current in the 1930s. So named because they were endorsed by the Marquess of Queensberry. And these rules of boxing were so pervasive that, the rules of a boxing match, like no fighting below the belt, no grappling, that sort of thing, those actually often transferred into the unspoken ethics of a street fight. If you hit somebody below the belt or hit them while they were down, that would be viewed as bad sportsmanship, even on the street. Finally, for stealth, so they just note that career criminals and military people would be well familiar with basic tricks like taking metal equipment and using boot polish to black it out, wearing fitting clothes to avoid the sound of clothing rustling, using cover and concealment to hide, walking near walls to prevent creaking floorboards, that sort of stuff. But all of this is great. I mean, these are all details that make every use of a general skill easier to describe, more period accurate, and more fun for your players, ultimately. And the same they do with occupation. So, for example, the alienist was a pioneering field in the 1930s when mental illness was poorly understood and frequently stigmatized. So the expert alienist at the time, basically, these are some of the things they'd have to deal with and some of the current techniques. So involuntary commitment, so getting somebody locked up in a sanitarium was startlingly easy. For the most part, the word of an expert in the field would be enough to commit somebody, especially if the patient was of low social standing and unable to speak up for themselves. Any kind of aberrant social behavior, including homosexuality, radical political views, or for women failing to perform household duties could be grounds for involuntary commitment. That's pretty insane when you think about it itself. The lobotomy, which was pioneered in 1935, became very popular treatment, but it really didn't see a lot of mainstream use until the 40s. But it was kind of at the cutting edge, no pun intended, for the 1930s. Forensic psychology, again, was kind of still just getting it started in the 1930s. Wasn't mainstream accepted until after the war. So this is where psychologists were called in as expert witnesses into trials to kind of talk about a suspect's mental state. But it does suggest that during pulp games, you might want to allow that sort of thing just to kind of allow for interesting stuff like criminal profiling, even though it wasn't really done at the time. And again, we go through all of that with each of the professions, giving some period examples of what was the state of the art, what kind of books would be very rare for the antiquarian, for example, the ways that things were dated for the archaeologists in the 1930s, which were not so sophisticated as we have today, The ways that artists would try and get funding back in the 30s. Art was increasingly politicized, and artworks were often overtly political expositions of the hardships and poverty caused by the Great Depression. Useful to know. And the authors, you had a lot of pulp authors finding some success, but they didn't pay much, so you'd have to write a lot of material, sometimes even publishing under several different names in a single magazine, just to make enough money to survive. For clergy, we have, what the kind of practices and roles within Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant religions. Then we have the more common criminal occupations. So gambling was in almost every form was illegal in nearly every state at the start of the 1930s. But economic pressure forced many states to legalize some form of gambling as fundraisers for charitable organizations, so that left the proper casinos to be run by criminal gangs. We also had organized smuggling networks, which were trafficking illegal goods like marijuana, heroin. There was also human smuggling was happening at that time, known as white slavery, so they'd get impoverished European, often Jewish women for enforced prostitution. Buenos Aires was the capital of this practice, but it reached all over the world. They do labor racketeering. The dilettante, there's some additional hobbies that they would get involved in. So popular and expensive entertainments like horse racing, boxing, yachting, parties, the standard implements in a doctor's bag. The 1930s were a hobo's decade because of all the people left destitute by the Depression. So they give you some examples of hobo slang, what they would do when riding the rails, and how they would live. For the journalists, they were hit pretty hard by the Depression, but radio also hit them because it gave work to some journalists, but not to others. Photography was very important, so having that on your skill set as a journalist would be useful. Radio journalism became popular as well, and stenography was a very useful skill for journalists who would have to record things people were saying really quickly. Pitman-style shorthand was most commonly used in America. For the military, they give some examples of ways the military could be involved without them being, actually from the Army. Now, one of these is quite disturbing. So we have the National Guard, which we still have, of course, today. We have the Army Reserve, again, which we have today. But then we have the strike breakers. So at the time, the USA was the only developed country in the world that allowed corporations to employ military force in the disruption of strike activities. Some corporations, notably mines and railroad companies, employed private armies numbering in the thousands for the purposes of discouraging union activities. These armies were comprised of war veterans who often took leadership positions, college students, unemployed laborers, and anyone else the companies could drag off the streets. That's pretty terrible. Being a union activist myself, I'm very glad I didn't come about in these times. Then they give some details of military life in the 30s, what kind of training you would get as a nurse back then, the kind of things that a parapsychologist would be looking into, things like teleportation, poltergeists, stories about raining of frogs, fishes, and so forth, weird artifacts. The pilots, so aviation was constantly developing and developing pretty quickly in the 30s. There were more passenger flights. Air races were a popular form of entertainment. Barnstormers, so they would fly their plane between small towns, giving paying customers demonstrations of trick flying and doing cool stuff and giving them rides and so forth. Police detectives, they would primarily have to do their work on foot, having a network of informants, friendly experts, and helpful locals. Forensic evidence was pretty basic. So, a lot of modern forensic evidence techniques didn't exist. We didn't have a nationwide fingerprint database or any of that kind of stuff. There were records of fingerprints and biometric data for certain criminals, and by the end of the 1930s, there were records of fingerprints kept in many major police departments. Just note they say major. Places like Arkham, Massachusetts may not count in that category. PIs, they would be basically more free to operate in less than savory ways than a police detective. So they might use stuff like truth serums, portable polygraphs, and covert listening devices. They were sort of pretty unregulated at the time. Professors, they were respected, but also somewhat suspicious to many people at the time because a lot of people didn't attend college at that time. So if you were a professor, you were definitely thought to be super smart and expert. And the system operated with a de facto tenure system. So it wasn't kind of explicitly stated that you had a job for life, but it was pretty much assumed, and no university really went against it. Compare that to today, where I'm an academic in my middle age and I have never had a permanent job and probably never will. So that system has pretty much died a death in America as well. Only 25% of positions have any chance of even getting on the tenure track that are advertised today. Tenure was intended to exist to allow scientists to make inquiries without worrying about losing their jobs because they were pursuing a politically dangerous topic that the institution didn't like, and the death of that is a problem for all of us, but I don't think a lot of people realize that. But back in the day, tenure was well established at this time, and politics were supercharged with a lot of leftist politics, and they still are today, but not to the degree that the right-wing radio host will tell you, of course. There are a lot of more right-wing fields within academia, such as economics, which is almost entirely based on, antiquated models of neoclassical capitalism. There is still quite a more dominant leftist viewpoint on most college campuses today than there is a right-wing position. And professors often benefited also from old boy networks. So as women weren't allowed to work in most cases, many professors benefited from having a network of people that they came up with in the university days, and they would be involved in different professions, and they would have secret societies, clubs, and organizations that would strengthen those bonds. Science in the 30s was kind of radical and breaking new ground. We had discovery of radioactivity, wave mechanics, and the model of the Big Bang was controversial and just come about in the 1930s. While it's still accepted today, there are many variations still of the Big Bang Theory, and the JWST, the James Webb Space Telescope, is challenging some of our assumptions about the early universe right as we speak. So, still evolving, that theory, and probably will do so for quite some time. And now, finally, we're into this list of NPCs. Now, this would be really boring for me to read through all this, so I'm not going to do that. But you'll see the main sections here. So there are 50 NPCs in total. So the first 20, they come with full descriptions, and they have a name. Here we have Nurse Parker, an unstable asylum nurse. There's a description and a quote, kind of what she might believe. 3 special things about her, like little habits or tics that she has, and then story hooks that she could be worked in. And that's the case for all the first 20 NPCs. And it gives only the skills that matter, where they're kind of above or below the norm. So for the nurse, she has first aid 5, psychoanalysis 2, reassurance 8, which is great bedside manner, possessed honesty 5, so she's good at evaluating people, stability 6, sanity 4, health 4. So she's not super stable, but her medical abilities are pretty good. And so we have a bunch of really interesting NPCs full of story hooks and good descriptions. But again, they don't flood you with stats. They only give you the stats that differ from the average, So the purveyor of antiquities will have, art history at a higher level. The detective, has assessed honesty, interrogation at 8, intimidation 6, evidence collection 6. All of these folks will have higher values in key stats that relate to their occupations, which makes sense. So we have 20 of these guys, including things like Egyptian priestesses, bumbling academics, sinister housewives. It's a great variety. Then we have some cultists, which is great as well. So a frat boy sorcerer, which is just an awesome concept to me. I love that. Jock lackey, a sorceress protege, a feral mountain witch. I guess that's her there. Dying widows, devoted cultists, a vengeful tribeswoman, and a bored housewife who just, experiments with doing interesting things behind her husband's back. Then we have thugs and henchmen. So these are, people that you might find when you're investigating, say, some kind of criminal organization, which could be a front for something darker and more mysterious. So you have henchmen, an indestructible thug, criminal entrepreneurs, tomboy thugs, remorseless killers, evil hobos, smugglers, and then you've got authority figures as well on the opposite side. So you've got good cops, tough guy editor to the newspaper, the curmudgeonly priest of the Catholic faith, an esteemed anthropologist, and then we have some just regular-ass people. Mary O'Reilly, the noisy neighbor, superstitious society wife, amateur boxer, junior mechanic. And then we have some colleagues that you might have, depending on what your occupation is, or people that might just be generally useful for a party to know. So an antiquities dealer called Daiho Lee, Amy Lee, an antiquarian shop girl, the thwarted reporter Tom Harper. Basically, he gets hints of weird stories that might be useful to you. We have a pilot for hire to get you around, discreet doctor when you need to be patched up without anybody noticing what you've been up to, and an enthusiastic physicist who can help you sort of deal with the wilder types of physics you may run into in your excursions into the unnatural world of the mythos. Then we have the super useful sanity and stability rules summary, which you should always keep nearby, reminding you about mythos encounters. If an encounter is a big reveal, the stability pool loss is triple the normal level with a minimum of 8. And then how you can use drivers, how casting spells affects stability, but we'll get to more of that in the next book. And how you can refresh your pools, so hard drivers, soft drivers, confidence, psychological triage, and between adventures. What happens, again, blast of stability, they remind you that your stability rating is reduced by 1, and you also suffer the effects of being shaken. How you can lose sanity, that's using a Cthulhu mythos investigative ability, encountering a mythos entity, or if you faint, you can reduce the sanity pool loss from mythos experience down to 1 point. You can gain sanity by defeating the mythos in a pulp game, but if you're in a purist game, you never regain sanity, basically, unlike in Call of Cthulhu, where a little bit of sanity is often given back when you survive an adventure. Sanity rating loss, it gives you all the examples for that, and how, they will pile up if you are already shaken or blasted in your stability. And then sanity rating gains. If there's no proof at all of your encounters with a mythos entity, your sanity rating recovers by 1 point. You cannot deny away a sanity loss of any kind resulting from your direct use of the Cthulhu mythos investigative ability. You can also get some false sanity gains by using 3 consecutive successful psychoanalysis tests. And then you have your pills of sanity if you're playing in a pulp game. And then there's some references useful to remind you about mental illnesses. You develop a mental illness each time your stability is blasted. If you're rendered mentally ill from a non-mythos occurrence, you instead suffer from shell shock. They talk about how psychological triage can help somebody suffering from mental illness be snapped back to temporary lucidity. And that's the resource book. I mean, it's super duper useful. Honestly, even though the screen is not as high quality as I had hoped in comparison to stuff, I mean, it did come out in 2008. So, our standards have gone up with all these, fancy Kickstarter productions and whatnot. But it still does the job, and the resource book is fantastic. So finally, got our brief little look at Rough Magicks. Sorry for the reflection there. You can see we've got a sorcerer summoning something grotesque out of the sky. Will he be eaten? Will it grant him power? Who knows? Could be either way. But this book is great. I think, magic of various types, often seemingly contradictory, is a big feature of the Lovecraftian mythos. Of course, they've got a huge book of spells for Call of Cthulhu. Less so for Trail of Cthulhu, but this little book, 40 pages, packs a remarkable amount of useful stuff in here. So the main contribution is they add the magic ability to general abilities. And then they give you the ways that this works. Basically, the spells that are listed in the core book, you can exchange the cost in stability points that you would normally pay for points from your magic pool. But you can only start gaining points in your magic pool when you have some kind of exposure to magic, whether it's being exposed to a mythos entity and having your mind cracked open to the other dimensions of this universe, or whether you're taught by as an apprentice by another magician or something like that, or if you read a mythos tome, that will allow you to start adding points to magic, and it will still need build points to do that. But then, being able to use your magic pool instead of your stability means you're much more likely to be able to actually use spells for a while before you sort of collapse and make yourself nuts, which is pretty useful. Then they've got new spells as well, new variations on old spells, including some pretty horrific stuff you need to do to contact some of the more popular mythos deities, variations of the Elder Sign, and then the Spore of Magic is about detecting magical sort of after effects when somebody's been using magic in a location. And then there's some theories about how magic works in the Lovecraftian world, and again, it gives you lots of options on how you might want that to work. And idiosyncratic magic, essentially it allows you to use magic to momentarily boost up your investigative skills in other categories. And then there's a new character sheet that adds magic to the general list. So we've got a wonderful introduction here, which talks about magic as a general thing. What kind of magic do you want to have in your game? And of course, all these rules are optional. If you think that these don't fit your game, you want to go purist. Magic is always going to crush your brain and cause stability, and you don't want to have a magic ability to dilute that. You don't want to use these new spells. That's totally fine. None of this is required. I think it's more fun. You don't have to go too pulpy. The spells will still be really grim. They'll still be really dangerous, and you won't be able to cast them on a whim. You'll have to pass a test and spend points, and you will fail sometimes. And if you're casting against another entity with great power, like a mythos entity, they will probably overcome you. So it's not an all-seeing solution like it is in other games. In D&D, when you cast a spell, it generally just does stuff. And you can put a stop to an entire encounter in many cases, even with a lower level spell. That's not so much the case here. So they give you a few different possible definitions for why magic works here. So, for example, magic is what most people believe it to be, so a non-physical energy permeating everything, and it relies on signifier secrecy and rotes and is more connected to perception than mentation. Others say that magic requires blood sacrifice. You're kind of delivering your DNA to Yog-Sothoth. All magic is to deal with spirits, or every spirit is in fact an aspect of Yog-Sothoth, or every spirit is an avatar of Nyarlathotep, or magic is toxic pollution from otherworldly forces. There's many ways you could fit it into your setting. Again, Trail of Cthulhu's tendency to give you lots of possible explanations pulls its weight here in a good way. So here we have the definition of magic as a general ability, and again, emphasizing that, this will mean that you can use it to cast spells, but in more purist settings, if you want to find out what a given spell might do, or what deities or cosmic forces a spell will conjure, you'll need to use Cthulhu Mythos a spend instead to understand that as an investigative ability. But some campaigns may also allow magic to be used as an investigative ability to figure out what a spell can do. The way the spells will work is, of course, will vary from game to game, as discussed here. So there's different ways of acquiring it. So you can't use character build points off the bat. Like I said, you have to have specific in-game experiences, which could be reading mythos tomes, communing with entities with mythos, by instruction from a magus, or by visiting cosmically touched locations. And the keeper might choose one or all of these to be valid ways of opening up the possibility of magic, but you've only got then magic potential. That's key. So at that point, the keeper will say, if you want, you can now spend build points if you survive this adventure, adding to your magic pool. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But since you've been touched by Yog-Sothoth or whatever, or you read the Necronomicon, you now have the ability to start a magic pool with your build points. And then they update basically everything to go along with this. So there's a new table here for key mythos tomes, and these give you magic potential. If you read the Al-Azif or Necronomicon, you can get a magic potential of 5 or 4 respectively. So you could get quite a few points in magic just by reading those books if you have build points available. And it gives you a page reference in the Trail of Cthulhu core book for the details of those books. But basically, instead of gaining Cthulhu Mythos points, you can use these to gain magic potential. It gives an example, so after an adventure, Bill has only 2 build points left over, but he wants to read Unos Prekalikan Kulton to get some magic as well. Normally that would allow up to 3 magic points, as we can see here, but he can only add 2 to Willoughby's magic rating due to having only 2 build points. But after the next adventure, he can finish the reading and get the last points if he wants to, using another build point. So then it goes through how you might gain magical abilities through Titans. So this is the game's word for, the great beings of the Cthulhu universe. And also there's a nice sidebar here about places of power. And it's drawing from the immortal magus in Lovecraft's story called He. He draws his power in a somewhat unspecified way from a specific house and lot in Greenwich Village. So they give rules for how to do something like that. So a place of power could, for example, provide 1 point or more of magic potential each year. So getting that point may require not only the expenditure of build points, but also a spell. Perhaps only a character with magic can gain more magic points from it, or perhaps gaining the annual magic point requires 1 ritual per month at the full moon. So you could set up scenarios where that becomes like a regular thing that the character wants to do, and each time that takes them down on some dangerous path. Or you could have the place of power providing 1 magic pool points, which can only be used at this spot. So even if you don't have magic, if you show up there, suddenly you've got a new pool that you can use if you know how to access it, perhaps through hours of meditation or something like that. You might also need to sacrifice stability to unlock the magical potential of the site. Basically, either of these 2 options are available on a first-come, first-served basis. So if a bad, insane magus comes there before you, then he'll get the magic rating point and you won't be able to get it. You can also draw upon a place of power using an incantation. So that's a new spell to cast at a place of power, unlocks that place's magical potential. So then we have, how you can gain magic from, again, the certain entities are more in tune with magic than others, like Cthulhu or Hastur. More magical entities like Yog-Sothoth, Sathalgwa, or Nyarlathotep may offer 3 points. Those who have more just brute force power like Atanathoa might only offer 1 point or even none. So with some entities, they will happily teach you a spell, but they require some kind of unsavory favor in return. So keep that in mind. Then you can get magic from teachers, but a lot of them will be nuts. So you need to be careful of that. You wouldn't be able to find a sort of ordinary erudite scholar who just loves magic and will teach you reliably on an ongoing basis. You're going to, dig up bits of lore here and there from crazy people, essentially. You could also get magic from territory, as we've been through. And then it gives you some nice examples of the use of the magic ability. So basically, if a spell requires the expenditure of stability pool points or a contest of the caster's stability against some other score, the caster can use magic instead of stability at a 1-for-1 exchange rate. If a spell requires a contest between a caster's ability and the target's stability, the target can resist using magic if she has it. Spells that cost sanity still cost sanity, and spells that require other expenditures still require those specific ability spends, but regardless of your magic score, you must still make a stability test to cast any spell that requires this. So you still have to pass the test, but you don't have to spend your actual stability. Instead, that comes out of your magic pool. So again, I don't think this is overpowered at all. It just allows magic to be more of a part of the game and actually more usable for players. And they give some great examples here of how this works in practice. So also as well as how some spells are slightly changed if you implement the magic ability, like Call Yog-Sothoth and Dread Name of Azathoth and so on. And they give examples of Investigator casting an incantation, then a Sanity 0 Evil Wizard casting an incantation, so he doesn't need to bother with stability test because he's already insane. Investigator is binding a monster, which is really cool. So in this example, he binds a Byaki and use it to fly to chase down an evil necromancer, which is great. A sanity 0 wizard casting a ritual. Sanity 0 wizard blasting an investigator. Refreshing the magic ability is tough, so in purist game, they refresh only between adventures, like your investigative skills. But in a pulp game, investigators can refresh their magic pools once per session if they can take an hour or more without interruption to study a tome, stare into the eyes of an idol, or otherwise open themselves to the fell energies of the mythos. In other sort of game, alien creatures and NPC magi who have given themselves completely over to the mythos refresh their magic pools completely once the first stars appear or every 24 hours, whichever comes first. There's also optional rules here for magic for non-magicians. So this is just giving a little possibility for if players really want to have a last-ditch attempt to try and cast a spell. If their team magician is down, then basically you would use the rules for multiple spellcasters, and you can spend magic or stability points to cast a spell, and it gives you some ways to basically try and do a last-ditch effort to, say, banish something or bind something if your main sorcerer is down and drooling on the floor. Then we have some really great info on magic and monsters. So it gives you typical magic ratings for all the main adversaries presented in the core book, from Byaki to Deep Ones, ghouls, the Great Race of Yith, and some of them will be quite interesting because, for example, the Hunting Horror in Service to a Magus or the Alpha Horror has a magic rating between 10 and 18, which is pretty big. Elder Things have magic at 7 or higher, and it also gives examples of spells they would know. So Dark Young of Shub-Niggurath are full of magical force. Their magic rating is typically 8 or more. They know things like Call Shub-Niggurath, Summon Dark Young, and one other spell. So it's really, really useful. And again, when you add in the magic ability and you add these abilities to these creatures, they become more dangerous foes as well. So giving the ability for your players to cast magic slightly more easily, but then having all the mythos creatures now having the same ability and often at much higher levels without any effort, I think it balances out pretty well. But then there are new spells as well. So you can call and dismiss Azathoth, which destroys about 100 acres or so, and it'll probably kill everybody there too. So they say this extraordinarily unwise spell must be cast outdoors at night, and it is extraordinarily unwise. It tells you about how you can oppose it, the costs in stability or magic and health, and so forth. And then we have things like Call or Dismiss Mordigian. Every caster must consume the raw flesh of a corpse with a 7-point stability test before beginning the calling spell. So that's a bit disgusting. Shub-Niggurath, you can call and dismiss them. Cost 6 stability or magic, and dismissing them costs 10 health from the caster or casters, as their very flesh rebels in sympathy with the black goat of 1,000 young. You can contact Hounds of Tyndalos relatively easily, but they can sort of show up whenever. It could be immediately or in up to 50 days as the keeper deems dramatically appropriate, which I think is kind of awesome. Some spells are designated as pulpy. So, for example, Binding Sigil, this is creating a sigil that makes binding a creature easier, basically cuts their inertia in half so that your test to bind the creature will be much easier. For a purist game, you wouldn't necessarily want to use that. The same for domination. So this is where basically you get either eye contact or verbal commands that will allow the caster to force the target to obey certain commands. It tends to be a little bit unpleasant to have that cast on you as a player, and it can really trivialize key encounters if you get some lucky rolls. So, for pulp games, it's cool because you'll be fighting lots of crazy shit all at the same time. In a purist game, maybe it's not the greatest fit. Hypertime Gate is like a hyperspace gate, but you're joining 2 points in time at a single point in space rather than joining 2 points in space. Another pulpy spell we have Ensorcel Item. So it prepares an item so that it can be used to store magic pool points. And it means, basically, they give a warning here, though. That giving the spell to investigators means the absolute end of magical resource management. In all but the pulpiest of games, the keeper is highly advised to keep it and ensorcelled items generally firmly in the arthritic hands of NPC magi. And I think that's a very good tip. And we have runic targets. So these will be keyed to specific monsters. Once summoned, the monster will pursue and kill the bearer of the runic target. So you create a runic target and you slip it into the enemy's possession, to their purse, their pocket, or whatever. You summon your Dimensional Shambler or Hunting Horror or whatever, and it will chase down that runic target and try to kill them. But of course, you'll need to know the relevant summon spell to make the best use of this. I think that's a really cool spell. A lot of spells, like in Call of Cthulhu, there's a number of steps. This is not something you do on a whim like throwing a fireball in D&D, right? You've got to prepare for this. You need something to carve your sigil on. You need to slip it onto the target. Then you need to run away. You need to do all the horrible things to summon the specific monster that you want. And you have to sit back and hope that it works. So there's a lot going on there. And if you unleash the entity and it's, it might stick around and cause all sorts of havoc. Who knows? A nice sidebar here about occultists of some repute during the Renaissance European period. So then we have some variations on old spells. So this is some pretty nasty stuff. If you want to call Hastur, for example, you can try out some variants. One of them is the caster must cut out his own tongue, 3 health. All interpersonal ability use hereafter requires a spend if even possible. If you're favorite of Hastur, a new one will grow back that knows the spell. I mean, that's a pretty big gamble to take. Or you can have a hole drilled in your skull in a specific spot. For Yog Sothoth, you must have been clinically dead or gone through a ceremonial death and rebirth. For Contact Cthulhu, you must asphyxiate oneself down to 1 health while meditating on an idol or image of Cthulhu, or you must drown a victim with their last sensation being hearing the word Cthulhu spoken aloud. Dark. And then we have the variations of the Elder Sign, and this just serves basically as a reminder that your players shouldn't necessarily assume they know what an Elder Sign looks like. They will still have to do research and make sure they're using the correct Elder Sign, and not just assume they know it because it's on their dice or whatever. This is a frequent manifestation we see in today's Mythos-related games, as is this one, but we've seen other versions like this kind of goetic symbol. We've seen this one as well, which kind of resembles the motion of crossing oneself. So, don't assume. Then we have another example of nasty things you might need to do for contacting Nyarlathotep. In particular, one of them is the caster's parents and children must be dead. So you'd have to kill your whole family to contact Nyarlathotep. I think that's pretty hardcore. Then we have some interesting stuff about the Spoor of Magic. So this is the trail that is left with magic. They give examples of how all the different areas of investigative skill could be used to possibly detect traces of magical activity, which is quite interesting. And then what full-blown magi can do. So these are like proper sanity 0 crazy magicians. They can command the physical world, summoning up storms, summoning up creatures. They make animals upset, particularly dogs. They can be immortal through things like cannibalism, necromancy, or hiding out in hyperspace. And they can do time travel like the Great Race of Yith or the Elder Things or stuff like that. Or they might even be able to move through huge lengths of time in weird ways like the Hounds of Tindalos or create hyper-time gates. So even though you've killed the wizard, he might come back from some future eon of time. Who knows? And then we have these expanded rules for idiosyncratic magic. The basic rules for idiosyncratic magic are provided in the Trail of Cthulhu core book, and that's from the Bookhounds of London campaign frame in the core rulebook. Basically, so you say what weird action you're going to do, give a notion of why the oddball theory behind that odd thing should work, and then describe where the investigator learned this technique if that's the first time you've done it. So no player should consider the spell grossly abusive. It must be strange, evocative, or at least dangerous, and should have a necessary condition, like you need a hair for an enemy's head, or you have a smear of the caster's blood, or whatever. And then they give some examples for all the different abilities where you're doing oddball practices in electrical repair. Like, you know how radios pick up those signals from years and years ago? That's when they're tuning to the ghost frequency. Then it's time to spit blood into a rum bottle if you want any peace. I'll try that and see if maybe that clears up our problem. I don't know about this, don't remember. Wait, I think it was on some radio program. Never heard of before or since. They give examples like that for every skill. You can also allow idiosyncratic magic to amplify investigative abilities. So in this case, if you want to use this optional rule, you do a stability test, and then you can exchange stability or magic points for dedicated pool points for one investigative ability. If the player or keeper doesn't have an immediate use in mind, the investigator can save them for later use in the adventure. The keeper can also trigger them for a horrific insight into the mystery, much as if the investigator had used Cthulhu Mythos. But where Cthulhu Mythos reveals a Mythos hand behind the scenes, idiosyncratic insight should point to more mundane clues. So the identity of Secret Watcher or the name of the beheaded girl, stuff like that. And then we have, finally, this little closing chapter on magic theory. Aleister Crowley is mentioned in here. The theories behind Lovecraftian magics. He presents it in a few different ways. I think in a lot of current Lovecraftian fiction, like The Laundry and stuff like that, you see mathematics and geometry and hypergeometry and stuff like that as referenced in Delta Green is a good example of that. So mathematics, hypergeometry, and perceptions of weird dimensions seems to be a common theme of modern portrayal of mythos magic, but they give some alternatives here and powerful formula like the Dona formula and all that kind of stuff. And then finally we have the new Trail of Cthulhu character sheet. Looks exactly the same as the other one, except until you look right here, there's magic right under hypnosis, and it has a note here that says, optional ability for use with Rough Magicks can only be acquired in play. So just a reminder that when you start building your character, you cannot use build points right away to get magic. You have to do what your keeper says you have to do to get that opened up. And now on the other side, you have some additional space where you can write in spells and items, which is handy, and any tomes plus their effects, which could be, how you're gaining additional magic potential. And that's it. It's a tiny book. It's theoretically very cheap at $9.95, but you will find that it's quite difficult to get the original price on some of these. Both of these items are a little bit hard to find in print at the moment, but if you look around on eBay, they're not going for outrageous prices. unlike, say, the Delta Green GM screen, which is going for a ludicrous cost at the moment. I found all of these for retail or less, so you shouldn't have a problem. They're all in brand new condition, and they've been a great addition to my table for Trail of Cthulhu, particularly Rough Magicks and this Keeper's Resource book. The screen is useful, again, as a resource, not just for you, but for everybody, really. I think, having those tables, references for weapons, can really end a lot of shuffling around in the rulebook when players are trying to tool up for an investigation or whatever. So highly recommend you pick these up. The Keeper's Resource book and screen, the original price is $21.95. So around these parts, it's typically about £16.99 if you find it at the right place. So just keep looking and you're bound to find a copy. Pelgrane Press themselves apparently are in the middle of switching up printers. So some of their products are out of print right now, but are hopefully going to be back soon. Particularly hoping for Eternal Lies to come back in print, because I just can't run a campaign that's 400 pages long out of a PDF. I will go insane. So I need a physical copy to reference and make notes and that sort of stuff. So bear that in mind. Some things that are out of print are slowly coming back into print. Like they didn't have the Trail of Cthulhu core rulebook on the Pelgrane web shop for a while until recently. Now there's copies everywhere. So hopefully that'll keep happening and we shall get more and more printed copies of stuff. And there you go. That is my summary of these 3 small but mighty supplements, particularly useful for the aspiring keeper in Trail of Cthulhu. Again, the game, it does feel substantially different from Call of Cthulhu, and for that reason, I do strongly recommend giving it a go. See which one sticks with your group, and then just run with it. There's also variations of the GUMSHOE system. You might bring in stuff from Nice Black Agents, which we'll look at later in the month, to up the combat intensity or to add even more pulpiness if you're playing a pulp game. All these games are kind of have interoperable elements, but just don't forget that the Kickstarter for a 2nd edition core book is coming in November. So maybe hold back until then if you want to see what the 2nd edition looks like. I expect some stuff like Rough Magicks options and some other optional rules to appear in the core, and hopefully they'll do a special edition or something really nice as well. But the core mechanics will be basically the same according to what they've said, but some things will be folded into the core rulebook that weren't before, so I'm very excited to see what they do with that. But for now, if you do have a copy and you're wondering whether these books are worth it, I would say they very much are. And they're not that difficult to find, especially if you're willing to use eBay and other sources like Noble Knight Games or whatever to track them down. You'll find them fairly easily, and they won't be ridiculously expensive like Eternal Lies. So that's all I've got to say, really. If you're a budding keeper for Trail of Cthulhu, definitely check these out. If you have any questions about what we've seen here today in these 3 different books, or if you want me to look at some more supplements, I've got a lot of stuff for Trail of Cthulhu, actually. Far from everything, but I do have a number of their hardcovers on my shelf, so I will profile those at a later date, so look forward to that. In the meantime, hope you all stay well, stay sane as much as you can. Leave comments below if you've got questions, just want to chit-chat about Trail of Cthulhu or horror games in general, and please do subscribe on the way out if you feel like it. All right, take care, guys, and see you next time. Bye-bye.